In the aftermath of the Second World War, as Europe lay physically shattered and politically unresolved, Berlin emerged as the most exposed fault line in the rapidly hardening Cold War, a city deep inside the Soviet occupation zone, yet divided among the victorious Allies. And by 1948, this anomalous arrangement became unsustainable as mutual suspicion between former wartime partners hardened into open confrontation, because Berlin was no longer just a ruined capital, but a symbol of competing futures. And when the Western Allies moved to stabilize and rebuild their zones of Germany through currency reform and economic integration, the Soviet leadership under Joseph Stalin interpreted these steps not as reconstruction, but as a strategic threat. Fearing a revived Germany anchored to the West and hostile to Soviet security, and it was within this climate of deep mistrust that the crisis unfolded, beginning not with tanks or gunfire, but with administrative pressure, as Soviet authorities gradually restricted rail, road, and canal access to West Berlin, testing Western resolve while maintaining plausible deniability. And for the city's more than 2 million inhabitants, these restrictions were not abstract geopolitical maneuvers, but an existential danger, because Berlin produced almost none of its own food, fuel, or electricity, relying almost entirely on supply lines that now lay under Soviet control. And when those lines were finally severed in June 1948, the blockade was complete, cutting West Berlin off from the outside world in a calculated attempt to force the Western powers to abandon the city or submit to Soviet terms. And for Washington and London, this presented a stark choice, because any attempt to break the blockade by force risked direct military confrontation with the Soviet Union only 3 years after the end of a devastating global war, while withdrawal would signal weakness and invite further pressure across Europe, undermining confidence in Western commitments at a moment when political alignments were still fluid. And as officials debated their options, the crisis revealed the early Cold War's defining dilemma: how to confront aggression without triggering catastrophe. And it was against this backdrop that an unprecedented idea gained traction: the notion that an entire modern city could be sustained exclusively by air, not as a temporary gesture, but as a long-term strategic response, transforming transport aircraft into instruments of political resistance. And although the plan appeared risky and even unrealistic given the scale of Berlin's needs, it offered a way to hold the city without firing a shot, reframing the confrontation from a military clash into a test of endurance, logistics, and political will. And under the direction of American and British commanders, including figures reporting ultimately to Harry S. Truman, the Western Allies committed themselves to what became known as the Berlin Airlift, a decision that signaled a fundamental shift in the Cold War from uneasy cooperation to sustained rivalry, because it made clear that the West would not retreat under pressure, even when isolated deep inside Soviet-controlled territory, and as transport planes began landing at Berlin's airfields around the clock, carrying coal, flour, medicine, and fuel. The city became a living demonstration of Western resolve, while Soviet authorities watched closely, calculating whether the effort would collapse under its own weight. And in the early weeks, the operation appeared fragile, plagued by shortages, accidents, and the sheer mathematical challenge of delivering thousands of tons of supplies every day to keep Berlin alive. Yet each successful landing reinforced a narrative of commitment that resonated far beyond Germany, shaping perceptions across Europe, where governments and populations were watching closely to see whether the United States would stand firm or falter. And within Berlin itself, the airlift transformed daily life into a ritual of survival as residents marked time by the sound of aircraft engines overhead, understanding that their future now depended on a continuous stream of planes descending from the sky. And this human dimension mattered profoundly, because the crisis was no longer just a diplomatic standoff, but a moral contest over responsibility and abandonment. And while Soviet propaganda portrayed the airlift as provocative and unnecessary, the visible reality of food and fuel arriving by air undermined efforts to depict the West as aggressors, placing Moscow in the uncomfortable position of enforcing a blockade that appeared increasingly punitive toward civilians. And as weeks turned into months, the scale of the operation expanded dramatically, with pilots flying narrow corridors through hostile airspace in all weather conditions, guided by rigid schedules that left no room for error, and every successful delivery became a quiet rebuttal to the assumption that the blockade would quickly force Western capitulation, while every crash or delay underscored how precarious the effort remained. And behind the scenes, the airlift required unprecedented coordination among military planners, civilian authorities, and international partners, illustrating how Cold War confrontation could mobilize vast resources without open warfare. And by sustaining Berlin, the Western Allies were not merely supplying a city, but asserting a principle that access, sovereignty, and political choice would not be surrendered through coercion, even when surrounded. And this assertion carried enormous symbolic weight, because it marked one of the first moments when the Cold War crystallized into a clear division between opposing systems, with Berlin as its most visible frontier. And as the blockade dragged on into 1949, it became evident that the outcome would shape not only Germany's future, but the broader balance of power in Europe, determining whether the post-war settlement would be revised through pressure or defended through sustained commitment. And in this sense, the Berlin Airlift was not a logistical improvisation, but the opening act of a prolonged geopolitical struggle, demonstrating that the Cold War would be fought as much through endurance, symbolism, and civilian resilience as through armies and weapons, and as aircraft continued to descend into West Berlin day and night, the city became a proving ground for a new kind of conflict, one in which restraint and resolve were tested side by side, setting precedents that would echo throughout the next 4 decades of global rivalry. As the airlift intensified through the late summer and autumn of 1948, the initial gamble hardened into a sustained campaign that tested the limits of technology, organization, and political nerve. Because keeping Berlin alive required not symbolic gestures, but precise calculations measured in calories, kilowatts, and tonnage. And planners quickly realized that survival depended less on dramatic flights than on relentless repetition, with aircraft landing every few minutes in a continuous aerial conveyor belt that left no margin for failure. And to achieve this tempo, the Western Allies transformed their air operations into an industrial system, standardizing routes, procedures, and cargo to maximize efficiency, while ground crews worked around the clock in conditions of constant pressure, knowing that even minor disruptions could cascade into shortages across the city. And this systematization marked a turning point in the crisis, because it shifted the balance from improvisation to endurance, signaling to Soviet observers that the airlift was not a temporary stunt, but a sustainable response. And as winter approached, the stakes escalated dramatically, since coal became the most critical commodity, required not only for heating homes, but for generating electricity that powered hospitals, water systems, and essential services. And flying coal by air was an immense logistical burden, forcing aircraft to operate at the limits of their capacity and pilots to land heavy planes on short runways under poor visibility. And yet the flow continued, aided by innovations in scheduling and navigation that allowed planes to land and depart with minimal delays, creating an almost mechanical rhythm that defined life in the city, and within Berlin, this rhythm became a source of psychological resilience. As residents adjusted their routines to the airlift's cadence, queuing for ration supplies while volunteering to unload aircraft, repair runways, and support the operation that now defined their survival. And this civilian participation mattered strategically because it undermined Soviet expectations that hardship would break morale and force political concessions. Instead, producing a population that identified its endurance with a broader struggle over freedom and abandonment. And internationally, the airlift reshaped perceptions of American power, presenting it not as an occupying force, but as a provider capable of mobilizing resources on a massive scale without resorting to violence. A contrast that resonated strongly in Western Europe, where memories of wartime devastation remained vivid, and trust in future security arrangements was still fragile. And for Soviet leaders, the situation grew increasingly uncomfortable because the blockade had failed to produce quick results and now risked becoming a propaganda liability, highlighting the contrast between restriction and supply, coercion and assistance, while any attempt to interfere directly with the airlift risked escalation into open conflict, a risk that both sides remained determined to avoid, and this mutual restraint defined the crisis's character as aircraft from opposing blocks passed one another in narrow air corridors under strict rules that prevented accidental clashes, illustrating how the Cold War's early confrontations were governed as much by caution as by hostility, and behind the scenes, diplomatic channels remained active, probing for compromises that could end the standoff without loss of face. Yet neither side was willing to concede the central issue of access and sovereignty, because doing so would set precedents far beyond Berlin. And as winter deepened, the airlift reached its peak, delivering record tonnage despite fog, snow, and mechanical strain, demonstrating that what had once seemed impossible had become routine through sheer persistence. And this persistence began to alter the strategic calculus, because the longer the airlift succeeded, the weaker the blockade's leverage became, transforming time itself into an ally of the West. And by early 1949, it was increasingly clear that the Soviet strategy had failed to force withdrawal or compliance, leaving Moscow with the choice of either escalating the crisis or ending the blockade under conditions that preserved its broader position in Europe. And this realization underscored a crucial lesson of the early Cold War, that power could be exercised not only through pressure, but through the ability to sustain commitment over time. And as Berlin endured its second post-war winter, supplied entirely from the air, the city stood as a living demonstration that coercion without escalation could be resisted, and that resolve, when translated into practical capacity, could reshape outcomes without a single shot being fired, setting a precedent for how the superpowers would confront one another in the shadow of catastrophic war. By the spring of 1949, the Berlin Airlift had evolved from an emergency response into a strategic stalemate that revealed the deeper contours of the emerging Cold War order, because neither side could now achieve its objectives without risking consequences far greater than those originally envisioned. And this mutual constraint defined the final phase of the crisis, as the Soviet leadership confronted the reality that the blockade had not broken Western resolve, fractured Berlin's population, or forced a revision of post-war arrangements, but had instead unified the Western allies, strengthened their moral position, and accelerated political developments they had hoped to slow or prevent, including the consolidation of West Germany and the deepening of transatlantic cooperation. And within Washington, the airlift was increasingly understood not merely as a logistical success, but as a political turning point, because it demonstrated that containment could be practiced through patience and capacity rather than confrontation, offering a model of resistance that avoided direct war while still imposing limits on Soviet pressure. And this understanding resonated strongly with European governments who saw in Berlin a test case for whether the United States would remain engaged in Europe's security over the long term. And as the crisis dragged on, the answer became unmistakable, because sustaining the airlift required enormous financial and organizational commitment that could not be justified as a temporary gesture, signaling that American involvement in Europe was no longer provisional but structural. And this signal carried weight far beyond Germany, influencing political calculations in France, Italy, and other states where post-war alignments were still contested, and the credibility of Western guarantees was under scrutiny. And for Berliners, the end of winter brought not relief, but vigilance. Because while supplies remained steady, the blockade itself had not yet been lifted, leaving uncertainty about how long their dependence on the airlift would continue. And yet the experience of having survived the harshest months strengthened a collective identity rooted in endurance and solidarity, transforming the city's symbolic status from a vulnerable outpost into a front line of democratic commitment. And this transformation mattered because it altered how Berlin would be perceived and defended in future crises, embedding the memory of the airlift into the city's political culture. And as negotiations progressed quietly behind the scenes, the Soviet position shifted, recognizing that maintaining the blockade had become counterproductive, as it imposed economic and political costs without delivering strategic gains. And in May 1949, the decision was made to lift the blockade, reopening land routes to West Berlin while allowing the airlift to continue temporarily as a safeguard against reversal. And this outcome marked a clear, if understated, Western success, because access had been preserved without military confrontation, and the principle that Berlin's status could not be altered through unilateral coercion had been established. And yet the resolution did not restore cooperation between former allies, but formalized division, because within months Germany was split into two states, and the city of Berlin remained divided, a permanent anomaly at the heart of Europe that embodied the unresolved tensions of the Cold War. And the airlift's legacy thus extended beyond its immediate humanitarian and logistical achievements, because it helped crystallize the political geography of post-war Europe, reinforcing the division between East and West that would define the continent for decades. And it also influenced the creation of new security structures, contributing to the momentum behind the formation of collective defense arrangements that would institutionalize Western cooperation in response to perceived Soviet pressure. And in this sense, the Berlin Airlift stands as one of the Cold War's formative confrontations, not because it produced dramatic clashes, but because it demonstrated how power, restraint, and endurance could be combined to shape outcomes without crossing the threshold of war. And as the Cold War settled into a long-term struggle marked by crises, standoffs, and proxy conflicts, the lessons of Berlin in 1948 and 1949 remained influential, reminding both sides that the line between pressure and provocation was thin, and that the ability to sustain commitment over time could prove as decisive as any military advantage. A lesson first written in the steady descent of cargo planes over a city that had become the world's most visible symbol of division and resolve. As the immediate crisis receded and the airlift wound down, its deeper consequences began to ripple outward across the emerging Cold War system, because the events in Berlin had clarified assumptions, hardened alignments, and reduced the space for ambiguity that had characterized the first years after the war. And for the Soviet Union, the failure of the blockade demonstrated the limits of pressure short of war, revealing that coercive tactics could backfire when they unified opponents and exposed contradictions between rhetoric and action. While for the Western Allies, the airlift validated a strategy of firm but restrained resistance, reinforcing the belief that resolve, when backed by material capacity and coordination, could deter escalation without provoking catastrophe, and this belief became foundational to Western Cold War thinking, shaping how later crises would be approached and how commitments would be signaled to allies and adversaries alike. And in Germany, the consequences were immediate and structural, because the airlift accelerated political separation by making clear that cooperation between occupying powers had broken down irreparably, leading directly to the establishment of separate governments in East and West, and embedding division into the heart of Europe. And Berlin's status as a divided city deep inside one bloc, but politically tied to another, became institutionalized rather than provisional, transforming what had been a temporary occupation arrangement into a permanent symbol of confrontation. And this transformation mattered because it ensured that Berlin would remain a focal point of Cold War tension, a place where abstract strategic principles were made concrete in daily life. And for the United States, the airlift marked a transition from reluctant post-war engagement to long-term leadership in Europe, because sustaining Berlin required commitments that could not be reversed without severe loss of credibility, effectively anchoring American power to the continent and reshaping domestic debates about isolation and responsibility. And this anchoring fed directly into the creation of new political and military frameworks designed to prevent future crises from being resolved through unilateral pressure, reflecting a growing acceptance that the Cold War would be a prolonged condition rather than a temporary dispute. And within Berlin itself, the experience of survival forged a collective memory that would define the city's identity for decades. As residents who had lived through hunger, cold, and uncertainty internalized the airlift as proof that endurance and solidarity could overcome isolation, a narrative that would be invoked repeatedly whenever the city faced new tests. And yet, beneath these symbolic achievements lay unresolved tensions, because the airlift had preserved access but not reconciliation, and the structures that emerged afterward were designed to manage division rather than heal it, ensuring that the city's fate would remain contingent on the broader balance of power between blocs. And this contingency meant that Berlin would continue to serve as a pressure point, a place where shifts in global strategy could translate quickly into local crisis. And as the Cold War progressed, this dynamic became increasingly apparent, with Berlin repeatedly returning to the center of international attention whenever confrontation sharpened. And in this sense, the airlift did not close a chapter, but opened one, setting patterns of behavior and expectation that would shape superpower interaction for decades, demonstrating that restraint and commitment could coexist, but only within a framework of sustained rivalry. And as historians later assessed the airlift's significance, they recognized it not merely as a humanitarian achievement, but as a moment when the Cold War acquired its characteristic form, defined by confrontation without war, division without resolution, and the constant management of risk in a world where miscalculation carried unimaginable consequences, a form first tested in the skies over Berlin, where the steady rhythm of cargo planes transformed a city's survival into a global signal of resolve. Over time, the Berlin Airlift assumed a place in Cold War memory that extended far beyond its immediate operational success, because it came to represent a model of confrontation that relied on persistence rather than provocation, shaping how policymakers on both sides understood the boundaries of acceptable pressure in a divided world. And this understanding mattered because it established a precedent for managing crises in which direct military action was too dangerous to contemplate, encouraging strategies that emphasized signaling, logistics, and alliance cohesion instead of force. And in this sense, the airlift functioned as an early rehearsal for the long standoff that would define superpower relations, demonstrating how resolve could be expressed through sustained commitment rather than dramatic escalation. And for the Western allies, the experience reinforced the importance of coordination, as the success of the operation depended on integrating military planning with civilian administration and diplomatic messaging, creating a template for collective action that would later be institutionalized in broader security arrangements. While, for the Soviet Union, the outcome underscored the risks of overestimating the effectiveness of coercive leverage in a context where opponents possessed both the capacity and the will to absorb pressure. A lesson that would inform subsequent calculations, even as rivalry deepened, and within Berlin itself, the airlift left a lasting imprint on urban life and political identity, because the memory of survival under blockade became a defining element of civic culture, shaping how residents understood their city's role as a frontline community whose fate was inseparable from global politics. And this identity was reinforced by the physical landscape. As airfields expanded, infrastructure was rebuilt with resilience in mind, and symbols of Western presence became embedded in daily life, ensuring that the legacy of the crisis was not abstract but tangible. And as the years passed, the airlift was commemorated not only as a triumph of logistics, but as a moral statement about responsibility to civilian populations caught in geopolitical confrontation, a narrative that contrasted sharply with later Cold War episodes, where civilians often became collateral damage. And this contrast helped elevate the airlift as a benchmark against which other interventions were measured, even as its unique conditions made replication difficult. And from a broader historical perspective, the Berlin Airlift illustrates how early Cold War decisions constrained future options by hardening divisions that proved difficult to reverse. Because while access to Berlin was secured, the possibility of reintegrating Germany into a neutral or unified framework diminished rapidly, replaced by a rigid bipolar structure that would persist for decades. And this rigidity shaped not only European politics, but global alignments, as states elsewhere drew lessons from Berlin about the reliability of Western commitments and the limits of Soviet pressure. And in this way, the airlift's influence radiated outward, informing perceptions and decisions far removed from the city itself. And as the Cold War unfolded through successive crises, from proxy wars to nuclear standoffs, the memory of Berlin in 1948 and 1949 served as a reference point for how confrontation could be managed, without crossing into catastrophe, reminding leaders that restraint required effort and that endurance could be as decisive as aggression. And although the airlift did not resolve the underlying conflict between East and West, it established a pattern of behavior that allowed that conflict to be contained, at least temporarily, within bounds that avoided direct war. And it is this containment, achieved not through treaties or force, but through sustained commitment under pressure, that defines the Berlin Airlift's enduring significance as one of the Cold War's formative episodes. A moment when the shape of the struggle was revealed in the steady descent of aircraft over a city whose survival became a global signal of resolve. As the Cold War matured and new generations confronted crises far removed from the ruins of post-war Berlin, the legacy of the airlift continued to shape expectations about how confrontation should be conducted in a divided world, because it demonstrated that credibility was not an abstract concept, but a cumulative product of visible commitment, sustained over time and under pressure. And this lesson influenced how alliances were maintained, how deterrence was communicated, and how limits were tested without being breached. And in this sense, the airlift became a foundational myth of Western resolve. invoked whenever questions arose about whether commitments would be honored in the face of coercion. And for Berlin itself, this myth was not merely rhetorical, but experiential, embedded in collective memory through stories of hunger, cold, and the constant thunder of aircraft that had transformed the sky into a lifeline. And this memory shaped the city's political consciousness, reinforcing a sense of exceptionalism rooted in survival at the intersection of global rivalry. And as subsequent crises returned Berlin to the center of Cold War attention, the airlift provided a reference point against which both restraint and escalation were measured, because it had shown that firmness need not require force, and that patience, when matched with capacity, could alter outcomes. And this understanding mattered as nuclear weapons came to dominate strategic thinking, narrowing the space for direct confrontation while increasing the importance of signals short of war. And from this perspective, the airlift appears less as an isolated humanitarian effort than as an early experiment in managing risk under conditions of existential danger. An experiment whose apparent success encouraged reliance on similar approaches elsewhere, even when circumstances differed. And yet the airlift's legacy also carried an implicit warning, because its success depended on unique factors, including clear moral stakes, favorable geography for air corridors, and a population willing to endure hardship, conditions not easily replicated in other contexts. And this distinction highlights a broader tendency of the Cold War to universalize lessons drawn from specific experiences, sometimes with unintended consequences. And in Berlin, the permanence of division that followed the crisis revealed how even successful resistance could entrench separation, locking in political outcomes that narrowed future options. And as the decades passed, the city remained divided, not because the airlift had failed, but because it had succeeded in preserving a status quo that both sides came to accept as preferable to the risks of change. And this acceptance underscores a central paradox of the Cold War, that stability often emerged from unresolved confrontation rather than reconciliation, and that managing division became an end in itself. And as historians reassess the airlift's place in this broader pattern, they recognized it as a moment when the Cold War's defining characteristics crystallized, including the reliance on endurance, the avoidance of direct conflict, and the willingness to institutionalize division as the price of peace. And in this, since the Berlin Airlift stands as a case study in how the early Cold War shaped not only immediate outcomes, but the long-term structure of international relations, leaving behind a legacy that influenced strategy, memory, and identity long after the last cargo plane had landed, and long before the walls that would later divide the city were even conceived. In the broader sweep of Cold War history, the Berlin Airlift ultimately revealed how the struggle between East and West would be governed less by decisive victories than by the management of limits, because the crisis showed that both superpowers were willing to apply intense pressure, but equally determined to avoid actions that could spiral into direct war. And this balance between confrontation and restraint became the defining rhythm of the era, shaping how crises were initiated, sustained, and resolved. And in Berlin, that rhythm was made visible in daily form, as aircraft moved through narrow corridors under mutually understood rules, embodying an unspoken agreement about where confrontation would stop. And this tacit understanding mattered profoundly because it demonstrated that even at moments of extreme tension, channels of predictability could exist, reducing the risk of catastrophic miscalculation. And as Cold War institutions matured, this logic was formalized through doctrines, communication mechanisms, and crisis management practices that owed much to early experiences like the airlift. And for the Western Allies, the episode reinforced the importance of unity, because the operation's success depended on sustained cooperation that transcended national interests, illustrating that credibility in a divided world was collective rather than individual. While for the Soviet Union, the outcome underscored the dangers of isolating oneself diplomatically through actions that appeared punitive toward civilian populations. A lesson that influenced later approaches even as rivalry deepened. And within Berlin, the lived experience of the airlift left an indelible mark on civic identity, reinforcing a sense of shared fate and moral clarity that distinguished the city from other Cold War flashpoints. And this distinction would later shape how Berliners responded to subsequent confrontations, drawing on the memory of endurance to navigate uncertainty. And as the Cold War unfolded through successive decades, the airlift continued to function as a reference point in political discourse, invoked as evidence that resolve could be demonstrated without violence, and that patience could yield strategic dividends. And yet this invocation often simplified a complex reality, because the airlift's success rested on a convergence of favorable conditions unlikely to recur elsewhere, reminding historians that historical lessons are rarely transferable without distortion. And in Berlin, the long-term result of preserving access without reconciliation was a hardened division that became increasingly normalized, culminating in the construction of physical barriers that made permanent what had once been provisional. And this outcome highlights the airlift's dual legacy as both a triumph of humanitarian logistics and a step toward the institutionalization of division. And as scholars examine the episode with the benefit of hindsight, they recognize that its significance lies not in a single moral or strategic message, but in its demonstration of how the Cold War operated in practice, through pressure without invasion, endurance without resolution, and the continual balancing of risk in a world where the costs of miscalculation were too high to bear. And it is within this framework that the Berlin Airlift remains one of the Cold War's defining moments, not because it resolved the conflict at the heart of Europe, but because it revealed the methods by which that conflict would be managed for decades to come, written into history by the steady passage of aircraft over a divided city that had become the testing ground for a new kind of global rivalry. As the Cold War entered its later decades and Berlin remained divided by circumstance and ideology, the memory of the airlift continued to function as both reassurance and warning, because it embodied the belief that isolation could be resisted through commitment, while simultaneously reminding leaders how narrow the margins of safety had been. And this dual meaning shaped how subsequent confrontations were understood, reinforcing a preference for managing crises through endurance rather than decisive rupture. And in Berlin, this preference became ingrained as a way of life, as residents learned to navigate uncertainty with the expectation that their city's fate would be decided not by local choice, but by distant calculations, a reality first made clear during the blockade. And this awareness influenced how Berliners interpreted later events, viewing them through the lens of survival rather than resolution. And from a strategic perspective, the airlift's success reinforced a broader Cold War assumption that credibility was cumulative and could be built through sustained presence, an assumption that justified long-term commitments even when immediate gains were unclear. And this logic extended beyond Europe, shaping how the United States approached other contested regions by emphasizing visible support and logistical capability as tools of influence. Yet the Berlin case also illustrated the limits of such an approach, because while access was preserved, the underlying conflict remained unresolved, institutionalized in structures that froze division rather than healed it. And this freezing effect became one of the Cold War's defining characteristics, producing stability that was real but brittle, dependent on continuous management and vulnerable to sudden shocks. And as the decades passed, the airlift was increasingly mythologized, its complexities simplified into a narrative of moral clarity that obscured the degree to which its success depended on restraint by all parties, including the decision by Soviet authorities not to interfere militarily with flights they could have challenged at great risk. And this restraint highlights an often overlooked aspect of the early Cold War, that survival depended as much on what was not done as on what was done. And in Berlin, the absence of escalation was as consequential as the presence of supply planes. And as historians revisited the episode, they emphasized this mutual caution as a central factor, complicating interpretations that cast the airlift solely as a unilateral triumph. And this more nuanced understanding underscores why the airlift remains relevant, because it reveals how outcomes in the Cold War were shaped by interaction rather than domination, by limits accepted as much as by pressure applied. And in this sense, the Berlin Airlift stands not only as a testament to logistical ingenuity, but as a case study in restraint under extreme tension, illustrating how the management of fear, rather than its elimination, became the foundation of Cold War stability. A foundation first laid over a city that survived not through victory or compromise, but through the steady, unbroken rhythm of endurance. In closing, the Berlin Airlift stands as one of the earliest and most instructive confrontations of the Cold War, because it revealed how a divided world would be governed not by decisive settlements, but by the careful management of pressure, restraint, and credibility. And what began as a Soviet attempt to force a strategic concession without war, instead became a demonstration of how endurance could counter coercion when matched with organization and political will, transforming a besieged city into a symbol whose meaning extended far beyond its ruins. And the significance of the airlift lies not only in the millions of tons of supplies delivered, or the lives sustained through a brutal winter, but in the precedent it set for how confrontation would be conducted under the shadow of catastrophic escalation, showing that force could be resisted without violence, and that commitment, when made visible and continuous, could reshape outcomes without triggering disaster. And yet this achievement carried an inherent paradox, because by preserving access without resolving the underlying conflict, it helped entrench a divided order that would define Europe for decades, making Berlin both protected and imprisoned by its symbolism. And this dual legacy captures the essence of the Cold War itself, a system capable of averting immediate catastrophe while deferring resolution indefinitely, stabilizing tensions through endurance rather than reconciliation. And as later crises unfolded, the memory of the airlift served as both guide and constraint, encouraging restraint while reinforcing the acceptance of division as the price of peace. And from a historical perspective, the episode underscores how the Cold War's most enduring structures were often shaped in moments of improvisation rather than grand design, when leaders confronted dilemmas with no safe solutions and chose paths that minimized immediate risk while creating long-term rigidity. And in this sense, the Berlin Airlift was not merely a humanitarian operation or a logistical triumph, but a foundational moment in the construction of a divided world, revealing how global rivalry would be sustained through persistence, symbolism, and the constant avoidance of thresholds that could not be crossed. And as the aircraft ceased their round-the-clock landings and Berlin's lifelines returned to the ground, the city emerged not liberated from tension, but permanently marked by it, a living reminder that in the Cold War, survival itself became a form of victory, and that the struggle between systems would be measured not only by battles won or lost, but by the ability to endure pressure without surrendering principle, a lesson first written into history by the steady passage of planes over a city that had become the front line of a new and precarious world order.